He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Kia ora, I'm Rose Matafeo, reading from Titanic and Other Ships by Charles Herbert Lightoller, published 1935. She was certainly making good speed that night of April 14th, but not her best, nothing compared with what she would have been capable in, say, a couple years' time. The disaster was just due to a combination of circumstances that never occurred before and can never occur again. That may sound like a sweeping statement, yet it is a fact. These were just some of the contributory causes that combined and brought into existence conditions of which the officers of the ship were to a great extent ignorant. Wireless reports were coming in through the day from various ships of ice being sighted in different positions. The one vital report that came through but which never reached the bridge was received at 9:40 p.m. from the Masaba, stating, "Ice report in latitude 42 north to 41.25 north. Longitude 49 to longitude 50.30 west. Saw much heavy pack ice and great number large icebergs. Also field ice. Weather good, clear." Phillips, the wireless operator on watch who received the message, was not to know the extreme urgency of the warning or that we were at the time actually entering the area given by the Masaba and are literally packed with icebergs, field ice and growlers. He was very busy working wireless messages to and from Cape Race, also with his accounts. The junior operator, Bride, of course, knew nothing about this vital warning, being off duty and turned in. Later, when standing with others on the upturned boat, Phillips explained when I said that I did not recollect any Masaba report. He said, "I just put the message under a paperweight at my elbow just until I squared up what I was doing before sending it to the bridge." That delay proved fatal and was the main contributory cause to the loss of that magnificent ship and hundreds of lives. Had I, as the officer of the watch or the captain, become aware of the peril lying so close ahead and not instantly slowed down or stopped, we should have been guilty of culpable and criminal negligence.
I've hit record. Just one moment, Minister. Be there in a second. Cheers. Guys, we're 3 months in, and we just want to check in on your hunt for the Canterbury cat. How's it going?
Yeah, absolutely. But before we get to that, though, Justin, did you know there was actually a cat connection to the Titanic?
To the Canterbury cat?
We know that there was a cat on the RMS Olympic called Jenny. Interestingly, the cat was transferred over to the Titanic in Belfast during Olympics repairs.
So there's even an argument to be made here that the fact Jenny was on board Titanic is evidence that the ships were in fact switched, because, I mean, who transfers a cat?
Now, one of the Titanic's most famous survivors was Violet Jessop, who you might remember was not only on the Titanic when it sank, Justin, but also on the Britannic when it sank, and the Olympic when it hit the HMS Hawke, and she survived all three disasters. Anyway, in her memoir, she spoke about seeing this cat in the ship's galley where she and her kittens were fed kitchen scraps. Interestingly, though, there are some reports that witnesses saw Jenny leaving the ship at Southampton and ferrying her kittens off the ship one at a time. And having no cat on board was such a bad omen that a scullion, who Jessop identifies only as Jim, supposedly abandoned ship after witnessing the cat leaving.
Right. And how does this relate to the Canterbury cat?
Well, Justin, that's what we're going to find out.
1, 2, 3.
RNZ News at 5 o'clock. Good afternoon.
There's now something of a political fight about how the money was awarded.
I've never seen a cat that big in my life.
The false evidence has been a key focus of the hearing.
After extensive legal advice, we have decided to air this season as a means of recouping the substantial losses incurred by both Radio New Zealand and indeed the nation.
We're back, baby. Did Titanic sink season 2? Kia ora, Carlo.
Tim Batt.
What a beautiful day to be back in the RNZ Cryptozoological Studio recording with you.
Deep diving on the RMS Titanic.
Or the Canterbury cat. It depends who you ask at this point in time.
Yes, well, I think that it's all going to work out for the best, Tim.
So, in our last episode, you managed to hold off from telling me about this incredibly explosive book that threatens to upend the known history of Titanic. Can we please get into the nitty-gritty of what was in that first edition print?
Yes, Tim, but before we do that, we need to set the scene for the night the Titanic sank. So, Tim, it's very important to know that there were a lot of signs that Titanic was going into troubled waters before they spotted the iceberg. The first is the air and water tests that Titanic routinely took on their voyage. These are just a matter of course, but they do have some bearing on decisions made on board the Titanic. Air and water temperatures both suddenly started plummeting between the hours of 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. on the night of April 14th. Now, do we know who was on watch during that time, Tim?
I don't. Do we?
Charles Lightoller. This was his watch.
Ah, right, of course.
Now, during that time, we have this sudden drop in temperature. And, importantly, a sudden drop in water temperature. And that's significant. It doesn't need to cause any alarm, but it is a very interesting statistic in and of itself, and it will become significant when the other elements come into play, and that is the ice warnings. So, during the day of the 14th of April, Titanic received 6 ice warnings. They started right off the bat at 9 a.m. from a ship called the Coronia, which said that it had spotted some ice along Titanic's course. Now, just a reminder, ships at this time, 1912, much like planes of today, they follow very set courses in the sea. They're all on what are called the shipping lanes. You will have heard that term, right?
Sure.
And so there are obviously variances on the degree of which you're following that arbitrary line on a map, but they are generally following the same course. So when ships send ice messages saying, I've spotted ice on this course, they are significant because they directly impact the course on which Titanic is set.
Right, and presumably these shipping lanes have been picked because they're free of things like ice and crazy currents and that sort of thing, right?
Exactly. That's hugely important. The shipping line that Titanic is on has been chosen because of how much further south it goes than the extent that ice generally extends at this time of the year.
Can I tell you the visual that's in my head?
Mm-hmm.
A glass filled with a cocktail, let's say it's a G&T,
Okay.
that's got like 4 ice cubes at the top of it, and they're those big fancy ice cubes that are really massive,
Yeah.
and they're occupying almost the entire space of the surface area of the top of the glass.
Yes.
And then a straw is trying to navigate through them. And that, to me, is the Titanic trying to get through this ice field, unbeknownst to the ship.
Look, that is actually quite a good analogy, Tim. I was worried there for a moment, but I think you have hit the nail on the head. Yes, Titanic is the straw heading into an ice-filled glass.
Great. Well, bad. I'm just stoked I got the analogy.
Now, the next ice warning that Titanic gets is from another White Star Line ship, the Baltic, and that's at 1:42. And Baltic is relaying a message from a Greek ship called the Athenia saying that there are large icebergs on this course. And this is a famous message because Ismay is known to show this to some of the passengers at dinner and lunch. Like, oh, look at this ice warning that we got.
And to refresh our memories, Ismay is the guy in the movie who looks like a bad guy and talks like a bad guy and in fact is a bad guy.
Yes, and look, the film certainly didn't do him a lot of favours. But yes, he's showing people this iceberg message.
Why?
Because this technology is fantastic. Marconi, Graham. The fact that you can get a message in real time from another ship on the sea is still a bit of a novelty to people. I guess an equivalent would be like showing somebody a funny message on your phone, you know?
Yeah, but this is no meme. I mean, I know there's that saying, the medium is the message, but in this case, I think the message is, hey, look out for that ice that's coming.
Totally, but I think it goes to this element of the grandeur scale of technology at this time, right? It's like, we're receiving these ice messages, we're on the safest vessel in the world. Isn't this all incredible? You know, what an age we live in. What a time. And admittedly, Captain Smith does go, hey, I think I might take that message back, if that's all right. But anyway, so that message goes through. Shortly after, another message comes in from the SS America, which it appears is never received by the bridge. And there's some contention of why that is, which we will get to when we talk a little bit about Marconi operators in a moment, which I assure you, Tim, we will.
But this is just another message saying, hey, heads up, fellas, there's some ice on this path.
Exactly, yep. Then we start getting into the more critical messages. They relate to ocean that Titanic is getting closer to. And the first of these is at 7:30 from a ship that you may remember, Tip, the Californian.
I do. This was one of the ships that was very close to Titanic when it sunk.
Yes.
And in my mind, heavily associated with the conspiracy.
Totally. It was so close that people could see it from the Titanic, and it could see Titanic. So that's how close it is. It sends a message at 7:30 saying we saw 3 big icebergs on this course. That is significant, that 7:30 message, for 2 reasons. One, it's not far away at this point. And at 7:30, Light Oller is in command of the ship. It's his watch. He is officer of the watch.
Right.
Then the most significant message comes in at 9:40, 20 minutes before the end of Light Oller's shift. And this is from the Masaba. And the Masaba sends this warning.
To Titanic, in latitude 42 north to 41.25 longitude, 49 west to longitude 5030 west. Saw much heavy pack ice and great number large icebergs, also field ice. Weather good, clear.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
So that message is saying there is ice that is extending from these 2 points of latitude and longitude. Now, just to paint a picture of how far that expanse of ice is, Tim, it's 136 kilometres.
Wow. So like 1 million rugby fields.
Well, I think it would be 1,360 rugby fields.
Okay, so more like 1.2 million Big Macs laid end to end.
Yeah, sure. Do you know the size of a Big Mac? Is that more relevant in your
it's
mind?
11 centimetres in diameter. Everyone knows that.
That is an extraordinary fact to have at your disposal, Tim.
You know how many watertight bulkheads are on the Titanic? This is common knowledge.
Each to their own, Tim, I suppose. So that message is basically saying from the Masaba, we have seen ice over this expanse of 136 kilometres. That's a lot of ice.
Yeah.
And it's very important because it's right on the Titanic's course. I mean, Titanic sinks 3 hours later, almost exactly in the middle of these coordinates where Masaba spotted ice. Now, this message is hugely significant. When you taken in conjunction with the air and water temperatures, which have very suddenly dropped, it is a very good indication that Titanic is on course for an ice field. Now, Light Oller himself knows that the presence of large icebergs leads to rapid drops in temperature. And he knows this because when he was 13, he sailed around the Horn and they found an iceberg that was so big, it took them like a week to get out of this iceberg. They got trapped in a bay in the iceberg.
Whoa.
So he's very aware of this, and everybody is aware of this at the time. You know, these are the reasons these temperatures are taken. It's part of one of the many safety precautions of navigating the North Atlantic at this time.
And I remember you telling me in the last season of this podcast that they had some of the best, do you call them sailors if it's not a sailboat?
Well, it's interesting, Tim, because Light Oller actually makes a point in his book that not all sailors are officers, but all officers are sailors.
Okay, but to my point, we do call, if you're on a boat, they're called a sailor, right?
Yes.
And Titanic featured some of the most skilled and experienced sailors and captains in the whole world, right? Because it was this big, effectively dick measuring competition between the ship owners.
Totally. Captain Smith, one of the most storied transatlantic captains on the planet. Even Bruce Ismay, the chairman of White Star Lines, no person in history had crossed the Atlantic as many times as him at this point in time.
So these guys knew what these messages combined with these measurements would mean, surely.
Well, to answer that question, Tim, I need to first explain the Marconi operators. So Titanic had a Marconi device. This is what sends those Morse code messages. And it was manned by 2 men. They are Harold Bride, the junior operator, and Jack Phillips, the senior operator. Now, these 2 men, they are responsible for sending out what was mostly private traffic. So people could pay, as we talked about in the first season, to send private messages, you know, into the Twitter of the time, just out into the North Atlantic, to other ships, to land stations. And that was a really exciting novelty. And that was their main purpose, these private messages. But their secondary purpose was to take messages from other ships relevant to navigation and safety. So on the night of Titanic sinking, they were receiving these ice reports, and their job was to take them to the bridge because it was generally accepted for the Marconi company within these shipping lines that ship safety and warning messages from other ships took priority above all other messages on the sea.
That would make sense because you told me previously that some of these messages were just about people basically arranging their affairs that were waiting for them in hotels on the shore of the next place, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, where were they landing to?
New York, Tim. So you don't remember where the ship is landing, but you remember how many Big Macs would fit into a kilometre?
Not all the time, but I just know the diameter of a Big Mac is currently 11 centimetres, though, to be honest, it's probably being updated as we speak because of shrinkflation.
Okay, well, we digress, Tim. So a lot of it was private traffic, and this feeds into a larger narrative, which we'll talk about very briefly, which is the night before Titanic struck the iceberg, on the 13th of April, Titanic's radio operators had been very busy attempting to fix their Marconi machine because it had had a failure. There had been some fault in the machine which had wiped out its ability to transmit. And so they had spent the entire previous night of the 13th of April into the early hours of the 14th of April fixing this machine. Then, on the 14th of April, they came within transmission range of Cape Race Station, which is a land-based Marconi station, which could receive their messages and then broadcast them to places like New York. It has a further transmitting range, right?
Right.
And so they're tired, they've been up all night fixing the machine, and now they also have a backlog of messages that need to be sent out. So they're busting themselves on the 14th of April to get through these stacks and stacks and stacks of private messages. That will become very significant, as we will see. What we also know is they are receiving these ice messages, and from what we have heard thus far, we know they're passing them on, right? Ismay has been given one of these messages from the bridge and shows it to people. Obviously, that despite the tiredness, despite the huge backlog, they are passing these messages on. And this is where we get into the first point of very significant contention, and that is what happens with this ice warning from the Mesaba.
This is the one indicating that they are about to head into 1.2 million Big Macs worth of ice.
That's right, yes.
Right.
So Harold Bride and Jack Phillips, the two Marconi operators, Harold Bride survives. So a lot of what we know about what happened within the Marconi room is thanks to Harold Bride. Significantly, though, at the time of this ice warning, Harold Bride was off duty. He had turned in for the night. And so it was just Jack Phillips alone. And so we don't have a clear picture of what happened with this message. The only person who ever speaks about this message with regards to how it was received by the crew is a fellow named Charles Herbert Lightoller.
Here he is. In
his book, Titanic and Other Ships. And this is, to answer your first question, Tim, the controversy around this book. Because when Lightoller's first edition comes out, it contains this paragraph.
Later, when standing with others on the upturned boat, Phillips explained when I said that I did not recollect any Mesaba report. He said, I just put the message under a paperweight at my elbow just until I squared up what I was doing before sending it to the bridge. That delay proved fatal and was the main contributory cause to the loss of that magnificent ship and hundreds of lives. Had I, as the officer of the watch or the captain, become aware of the peril lying so close ahead and not instantly slowed down or stopped, we should have been guilty of culpable and criminal negligence.
Wait, so Lightoller said he put it under a paperweight? Is he kind of blaming himself for the sinking of Titanic?
No, Tim. He is saying that Phillips told him that Phillips put the message under a paperweight at his elbow and didn't take it to the bridge.
Oh, Phillips being the chief Marconi operator, the radio dude.
That's right. So what Lightoller is saying here is that because Phillips didn't hand that message to the bridge, it's Phillips' fault that the Titanic hit the iceberg.
Holy smokes. So he's laying this entire tragedy at the guy who was in charge of the Marconi machine's feet.
Yeah, he even puts it in italics in his own book, saying,
That delay proved fatal and was the main contributory cause to the loss of that magnificent ship and hundreds of lives.
So he is, in other words, saying it is Jack Phillips' fault that this ship sank. And where is he taking that information from? He's saying it because He's saying Phillips told me that he got this message and didn't pass it to him. The point is, we have to work out when this conversation happened.
Why?
Because we need to understand when Phillips told this to Lightoller, right? Because the only person who has ever said Phillips said this is Lightoller. This is not backed up by anyone else's testimony. This is purely from Charles Lightoller himself.
So, Carlo, this is kind of like if I left my toddler Remy, who's 2.5 years old, with a glass of milk in the lounge and left for 30 seconds, which happened the other day, and I came back and the glass had spilled over, and I say, "Did you spill the glass?" And he said, "No, a dragon did." And I say, "There was a dragon here?" And he said, "Yes, but only I can see the dragon."
That's basically exactly it, Tim. Except, unfortunately, 1,500 souls perished.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
So Lightoller says this conversation takes place on Collapsible B.
Okay, that feels a little hard to believe to me. So we've got two dudes facing certain death in the North Atlantic Ocean on an upside-down capsized lifeboat. And with his final moments on this mortal coil is going, "Oh, by the way, you're not criminally negligent in any way. This is all my fault." Ugh.
Yeah, and Phillips says, "Hey, here is this exact message that I received from Masaba. Sorry I didn't pass it on." That's what Lightoller is asserting here. And what's even more interesting, Tim, is that no one else who survived on Collapsible B sees Jack Phillips on that lifeboat.
Whoa.
Including Harold Bride, the junior officer who is on that lifeboat. Now, Harold Bride says the last time that he saw Jack Phillips, they'd come out from the Marconi office, which they manned until the very end, right? They just kept sending out distress signals. And Harold Bride really paints a picture of Jack Phillips as a hero, right? The guy just kept sending messages until there was water coming into the Marconi office, trying to bring ships to the rescue. And it's really thanks to Jack Phillips' work that the ship that picked everybody up, the Carpathia, even knew about it, right? The guy just put everything into trying to get help for this stricken vessel. And the last time that Harold Bride, who survives, ever sees Jack Phillips is they say goodbye to each other and Phillips says, "I'm going to test my luck at the other end of the ship," and walks aft, right down to the back of the ship. And Bride goes up to help try and get the lifeboats off the roof of the officers' quarters. And that's how he gets caught up in Collapsible B, gets sucked in underneath it, and pulled out into the sea.
So basically we've got two competing narratives here. We've got Lightoller, who is cast as a hero in the pages of history, and he's laying this at the feet solely of the Marconi operators. But you're saying there's very compelling evidence to say that the Marconi operators were actually heroes themselves who fought to the bitter end getting these messages out to draw ships in to help survivors.
Absolutely, Tim. And there's so much evidence to support the fact that they were very actively making sure the bridge received these ice warnings on the day. And that's borne out by the fact, like, Ismay got that message from someone, right? He got it from the bridge. So it had to have been passed on. Like, they are making the effort to pass these messages onto the bridge.
So then why would Lightoller make such an explosive claim in his book if it doesn't seem to be backed up with evidence?
Well, Tim, to answer that, we need to look at the second edition, because you have to remember when he did publish this in the first edition, it was so controversial that the Marconi company sued him because they said, "You have no evidence to support this assertion, and you have just essentially blamed this disaster on one of our employees without any evidence," right?
Fair. I mean, it's not every day that I back big radio operator, but I think they've got a valid point with this one.
So he then released a second edition years later, and this is what he revised that paragraph to.
The operator who received it was busy at the time, working wireless messages to and from Cape Race, also with his accounts, and he put the message under a paperweight at his elbow, just until he squared up what he was doing and he would have brought it to the bridge. That delay proved fatal and was the main contributory cause to the loss of that magnificent ship and hundreds of lives.
I might be missing something, but that sounds incredibly similar to the first assertion he made.
Yes, Tim, except for one very crucial omission, and that is the conversation that he said took place with Phillips is no longer in his book. So in the first edition, he says that he chatted directly with Phillips, and Phillips told him about this message and that he did nothing about it. And that's a conversation that only Lightoller witnessed. But by the time of the second edition, that conversation no longer exists.
But he's still maintaining the claim that what he was told is the same result.
Exactly. So with even less evidence. And this is really explosive testimony because he had to know about that ice warning from somewhere. And why does he have to know? Because in the Titanic inquiries, they talk about that ice warning. And he's aware of that ice warning. But he says at the time that he knows about the ice warning because Jack Phillips told him about it on the collapsible boat before he died. And he's the only person who ever witnesses that conversation.
So my question, Carlo, is how does this link into the conspiracy of the Titanic being intentionally sunk for insurance money?
I'm not sure that it does, Tim. But what I can tell you is that there's no evidence to support the fact that this conversation ever happened or that Phillips was ever on that lifeboat. So this is what Harold Bride says about the last moments he sees Jack Phillips.
I called Phillips several times but got no response, but learned later from several sources he was on this boat and expired even before we were picked off by the Titanic's boat.
So Bride says here he heard from other people that Phillips was on this boat, but he never saw it with his own eyes. And the accounts that he's referencing there is Lightoller's. Because here's another testimony from Archibald Gracie, another survivor on this same lifeboat.
I think that there were 3 or 4 who died during the night aboard our boat. The Marconi junior operator told me that the senior operator was on this boat and died, presumably from the cold. When the presence of the Marconi boy at the stern was made known, Lightoller called out, questions which all us heard as to the names of the steamships with which he had been in communication for assistance.
Okay, this is all good stuff, but Marconi boy really stood out to me, Carlo. Is that like the official nomenclature for these guys?
It's definitely not, Tim. That's very much a product of Archibald Gracie. Colonel Archibald Gracie, what a guy.
Good on the nicknames.
So this is, again, quite explosive, right? Gracie is the only other witness that talks about Phillips being on this lifeboat.
Right.
And he gets that information from Bride. Bride says he got that information from somebody else. So there is no first-hand account of Phillips being on this boat except for the first edition of Titanic and Other Ships by Charles Lightoller. That is the only time anyone ever goes on the record and says he is on there. He gets sued by Marconi, and that's the thing that he takes out.
So we've got Lightoller, a guy who was in charge of the Titanic until less than 2 hours before they hit the iceberg, blaming one single dude for not bringing a message to his attention. And he can basically just hand wave the entire culpability of Titanic sinking to this one guy. And there's no evidence from any other person except Lightoller that he had a conversation with him which would give him the evidence that this message was never passed on. Am I getting that right?
That's right.
Can I be honest with you? This Lightoller guy won me over early when he took down an airship from a boat, but now he's starting to sound like a bit of a dick.
And this is the important thing, Tim, because Lightoller points it out himself in his own words. He says that if we knew about this ice warning and we did nothing, then we should be held guilty of criminal negligence. He says that. But the only person who could prove that he never received that ice warning is conveniently a man who in his dying moments gives him that absolution by telling him, "Oh, I'm sorry, I never passed on that critical ice message."
Pretty convenient.
And that's why I think it's so important that this narrative has to exist for Lightoller. Because if he did have the Masaba ice warnings and did nothing, then it is his fault. It's not Jack Phillips. If he got that message that was received by Titanic, and we know that it was received, and did nothing, then all of this comes down to him. Because he was the officer in charge. When that message came through, they had all of the evidence to suggest that they were in colder and potentially iceberg-prowled waters. And he had a message in his hand, potentially, if he did receive it, that said there was 136 kilometres of ice dead ahead of their path. And yet, no precautions were taken to slow Titanic down, double the watch, or make any provision for the possibility of ice. We can never be sure if he did receive the message. But what we can be sure of is the only person who can account for him not having that message is Phillips. And the only person who saw Phillips and could corroborate this story of Phillips not passing him the message is Lightoller.
This man who is otherwise pretty heroic to the point of a lot of men died because of how quote-unquote heroic he is.
Yeah.
Lied about this one aspect of what happened.
Just this itty-bitty little lie. If he's guilty of anything, Tim, it's being too honourable. That and perjury.
What's fascinating to me is Lightoller is a figure who is so steadfastly attached to this idea of sort of civil chivalry that he probably condemned dozens of men to death by leaving seats empty on boats that were being sent off. But he still seemed to have potentially convinced himself of a lie just so that he can continue to inhabit this place in his own story and history of this upright, perfect gentleman who is acting in accordance with the highest morality at all times. But it seems like it's impossible the way that he tells it.
Well, Tim, what if the lie just wasn't for himself? What if he also lied to the official inquiry? And I can prove it. But that has to wait until the next episode.
Thanks for listening. You can follow and listen to both seasons of Did Titanic Sink on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcast app so you don't miss an episode. This podcast was written by Carlo Ritchie, directed by Abby Howes, and produced and edited by me, Tim Batt. The executive producer for the series is Justin Gregory. Tim Watkin is executive editor for audio at RNZ. Ka kite.